Chapter 1. The Ghost of Youth. The air conditioning inside the apex boardroom of the Zenith Tower was set to a sterile, unforgiving 68 degrees, yet the atmosphere was suffocatingly dense. The mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the tense, drawn faces of the city's most ruthless corporate titans. Among them, Tsai Ming-ju sat like a sovereign carved from glacial ice. Clad in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit that clung flawlessly to his broad shoulders, his presence was a masterclass in silent intimidation. His long aristocratic fingers rested lightly over a Montblanc pen, occasionally tapping the gold nib against the leather portfolio before him. Every tap echoed like a judge's gavel. At 28, the CEO of Psy Corporation was a man devoid of visible human frailty. His jawline was sharp enough to draw blood, his dark eyes resembling the surface of a frozen obsidian lake, impenetrable, beautiful, and deadly. He was here to finalize the acquisition of the coveted South Bay Harbor project. It was supposed to be a bloodless slaughter, a mere formality, until the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. The rhythmic, commanding click-clack of Christian Louboutin stilettos shattered the silence. Ming-ju did not look up immediately. He despised tardiness. But a sudden, inexplicable shift in the room's barometric pressure forced his gaze upward. The air in his lungs violently evaporated. Standing at the threshold, flanked by two anxious-looking junior executives, was a woman who seemed to have stepped out of a meticulously tailored nightmare. She wore a pristine white silk blouse tucked sharply into a high-waisted, tailored black pencil skirt. Her raven hair, which he remembered smelling of cheap strawberry shampoo and always falling in soft, unruly waves, was now brutally restrained in a sleek, severe chignon at the nape of her neck, linen axia. Ming-ju's breath hitched, a microscopic physical betrayal that only he felt. The Montblanc pen in his hand stilled. Beneath the mahogany table, his knuckles turned a ghastly, bone-white hue as his grip tightened enough to snap the expensive resin. 4 years, 1,460 days of screaming, deafening silence, and here she was, the ghost of his youth, the phantom limb that never stopped aching, walking into his boardroom as the newly appointed chief secretary and lead negotiator of Apex Holdings' fiercest rival. Anaxia walked with the terrifying grace of an executioner. Her spine was a rod of steel. Her chin tilted at an angle that bordered on aristocratic arrogance. As she took her seat directly across from him, their eyes met. Ming-ju searched desperately for a flicker of recognition, a tremor of the shy, radiant girl who used to bury her face in his chest when the thunder rolled. But there was nothing. Her eyes, once a warm, molten amber that looked at him like he hung the stars in the sky, were now vacant, flat, and chillingly devoid of emotion. She looked at him the way one looks at a particularly uninteresting piece of furniture. "Apologies for the slight delay, gentlemen," and Axia's voice rang out. It was a beautiful voice, smooth and modulated, but stripped of all its former melody. It was the voice of a machine. "Apex Holdings is ready to present our counter-offer for the South Bay Harbor." For the next 2 hours, Ming-ju was subjected to a psychological vivisection. He watched entirely paralyzed by a cocktail of shock, grief, and twisted admiration as Anaxia ruthlessly dismantled his company's bidding strategy. She cited zoning laws, projected depreciation algorithms, and supply chain vulnerabilities with terrifying precision. Every time she spoke, she cornered Psy Corp further into a mathematical checkmate. She was brilliant, she was lethal, she was completely unrecognizable. "Ming-ju, do you think him smart enough to work for you one day?" The echo of a memory, saturated with the scent of summer rain and jasmine, violently assaulted his mind. They had been sitting under the rusted awning of her dilapidated university dorm. She had been eating a cheap convenience store ice cream, a dollop of vanilla smeared on her nose, looking up at him with blinding, innocent adoration. The memory physically hurt. It was a sharp, jagged blade twisting between his ribs. Ming-ju swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the stiff collar of his shirt. He forced his mind back to the present. "Your projections on the maritime tax tariffs are aggressively optimistic, Miss Lin," Ming-ju finally spoke. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a visible shiver down the spines of the lesser executives. But Anaxia did not even blink. "Optimism is for amateurs, President C," she replied smoothly, her red lips curving into a smile that did not reach her dead eyes. "My projections are based on the newly drafted municipal bylaws, which I assume your legal team failed to thoroughly review. Apex Holdings bids $3 billion, with a guaranteed municipal infrastructure integration." The room erupted into hushed, frantic whispers. It was a killing blow. Anaxia had just checkmated the king. As the meeting adjourned, the executives scrambled to pack their briefcases, eager to escape the suffocating tension. Anaxia stood up, her movements crisp and efficient. She snapped her laptop shut and handed it to her assistant. Ming-ju stood as well, his imposing 62 frame casting a long, dark shadow across the table. He rounded the mahogany barrier, his long legs eating up the distance between them until he was standing a mere foot away from her. The scent of her hit him then, no longer strawberry and jasmine but Tom Ford's black orchid. Expensive, dark and untouchable. Anaxia, he murmured, the two syllables scraping against his throat like crushed glass. It was not a professional address, it was a plea. Anaxia paused. She slowly turned her head. Her expression was a masterclass in polite indifference. She extended a perfectly manicured hand, the nails painted a vicious, blood-red hue. Presidency, she said, her voice dropping an octave, ringing with absolute, bone-chilling finality. It is an honor to finally cross paths with you. I look forward to our future competitions. She didn't know him. Or rather, she had murdered the version of herself that did. As Anaxia turned on her heel and walked out the door, her spine rigid, no one saw the way her left hand, hidden safely inside the pocket of her tailored skirt, trembled so violently that her fingernails bit into her palm, drawing tiny crescent-shaped droplets of blood. Chapter 2, The Scars We Hide. The elevator descent from the 80th floor was a solitary confinement cell for Anaxia. As the digital numbers ticked downward, the adrenaline that had fueled her ruthless performance in the boardroom began to evaporate, leaving behind a cold, nauseating dread. She leaned heavily against the polished steel wall of the elevator, pressing her forehead against the cool metal. She closed her eyes, but the darkness offered no sanctuary. Behind her eyelids, the immaculate image of Tsai Ming-ju was instantly replaced by the blinding, erratic glare of headlights piercing through a torrential downpour. 4 years ago, the memory did not just play in her mind. It assaulted her senses. She could feel the freezing, needle-like rain slashing against her skin. She could smell the metallic tang of blood mixing with the wet asphalt. She could hear her own voice, ragged and unrecognizable, screaming into a shattered cell phone. Ming-ju, pick up, please. It had been the night of his mother's visit. Madame Tsai, draped in pearls and smelling of elitist contempt, had tossed a cashier's check for 5 million onto the cheap linoleum floor of Anaxia's rented apartment. My son is playing a charity game with you, little girl, but Tsai Corporation is facing bankruptcy. He needs a wife with power, not a charity case. Take the money, or I will ensure you don't survive in this city. Anaxia hadn't taken the money. She had run out into the storm to find Ming-ju, desperate to hear him say it was a lie. But he had been the one to deliver the fatal blow. Standing in the lobby of his corporate headquarters, surrounded by security, his eyes had been colder than the rain outside. It was a phase, Anaxia, in marrying Song Ru-wei. Don't embarrass yourself further. The words had been a physical blow, but the true agony came an hour later. Blinded by tears, wandering aimlessly across a desolate intersection. She hadn't seen the black luxury sedans speeding through the red light until it was too late. The impact had thrown her violently onto the pavement. The physical pain had been white-hot, tearing through her abdomen like a jagged saw. But it was the warm, sticky pooling of blood between her thighs that broke her mind. She hadn't even known she was 6 weeks pregnant until she was losing the child. Lying in the mud, her life force draining away, she had dialed Ming-ju's number 1 last time. It rang and rang and rang. Finally it connected. But it wasn't Ming-ju's voice that answered. It was the sweet, sickly, triumphant voice of Song Ru-wei. As in the shower, Anaxia, have some dignity and stop calling. Click. In the elevator, Anaxia gasped, her eyes snapping open as the doors chimed and slid apart at the ground floor lobby. Her chest heaved. The phantom pain in her womb throbbed in time with her racing heart. She pressed a hand to her stomach, smoothing down the immaculate fabric of her skirt, burying the broken, bleeding girl deep down beneath layers of armor forged from 4 years of relentless, agonizing survival. She stepped out into the lobby. She was Lin Anaxia, chief secretary. She did not bleed anymore. Anaxia, the voice desperate and harsh, echoed through the cavernous marble lobby. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The heavy, hurried footsteps closing the distance between them belonged to Ming-ju. She stopped, plastered on her corporate mask, and pivoted slowly. Ming-ju had bypassed his security detail. His chest was rising and falling rapidly beneath his expensive suit. The legendary composure of the CCO was fracturing before her eyes. He reached out, his large hand wrapping around her slender wrist. The heat of his skin burned through the silk of her blouse, sending a jolt of toxic electricity straight to her heart. Let go of me, she commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed the quiet, terrifying density of a black hole. Ming-ju's grip tightened fractionally, his dark eyes searching hers with a frantic, starving intensity. Where have you been? 4 years, Anaxia. I turned this country upside down looking for you. Why did you vanish? Why are you acting like you don't know me? Anaxia looked at his hand wrapped around her wrist. She felt no warmth, only the phantom sensation of mud and rain. Slowly she raised her gaze to meet his. President Tsai, she said, her tone laced with absolute ice. I believe our relationship ended quite clearly 4 years ago. You made your choices. I survived mine. If you touch me again outside of a professional capacity, I will have my legal team file a harassment suit before your stock drops another point. Am I understood? Mingju physically recoiled as if she had struck him across the face. The shock in his eyes morphed into a raw, bleeding agony. His fingers loosened, and he let his hand drop to his side, and Wuxia did not wait for a response. She turned and walked out the revolving glass doors into the blinding afternoon sun, leaving Tsai Mingju standing alone in the marble lobby, a king trapped in a tomb of his own making. Chapter 3: A Deal with the Devil. 3 weeks later, the invincible Xi Corporation was bleeding out. The financial crisis hit with the sudden, catastrophic violence of a tsunami. A critical supply chain collapse in Europe, coupled with aggressive short selling orchestrated by shadow investors, had brought Psy Corp's stock to its knees. The only viable lifeline was an immediate, high-liquidity merger with Apex Holdings. Sitting in his cavernous, shadowy office at midnight, Mingju stared at the glowing monitors detailing his company's ruin. He rubbed his temples, a dull, throbbing migraine pulsing behind his eyes. He hadn't slept in 72 hours. But the financial ruin was secondary to the torment eating his soul. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw an Wuxia's cold, dead stare. The intercom buzzed, loud in the silence. President Tsai, his assistant's voice trembled slightly. The representatives from Apex Holdings are here for the emergency merger negotiations. Miss Lin is leading them. Mingju's head snapped up. When an Wuxia entered the office, she looked like a goddess of war descending to survey the carnage. She wore a dark crimson suit, the color of dried blood, and carried a thick leather folder. She dismissed her team with a flick of her wrist, waiting until the heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving the two of them entirely alone in the dim, massive room. You look terrible, President Tsai, an Wuxia observed, her voice devoid of sympathy. She took a seat gracefully, crossing her long legs. Mingju stared at her, drinking in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst. You orchestrated this, he rasped, his voice rough with exhaustion. The shadow investors, Apex pulling the European suppliers. You cornered me. I merely capitalized on your vulnerabilities, Wuxia replied, opening her folder. Business is business. You taught me that, remember. Now, Apex Holdings is willing to inject the necessary capital to save Psy Corp. But my board requires absolute security. We require a merger of not just assets but optics. Mingju frowned, leaning forward. Optics, and Wuxia slid a thick, bound document across the glass desk. A contract marriage. 1 year. The media will eat up the narrative of a romantic reconciliation between two rival executives. It stabilizes your stock, secures our investment, and gives Apex a 40% voting block in your board. Mingju stared at the document, his mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of her demand. The woman he loved, the woman who had looked at him with absolute abhorrence 3 weeks ago, was proposing marriage as a hostile takeover strategy. You want to marry me to control my company, he stated, a dark, bitter laugh escaping his lips. I don't want to marry you, Wuxia corrected, her eyes flashing with a sudden sharp venom. I want to humiliate you. I want to bind you to a contract where you dance to my tune. I want to watch the mighty Tsai Mingju pretend to be a devoted husband to the girl he threw away like garbage. The venom in her voice was the most emotion she had shown him since her return. Mingju felt a perverse thrill of hope. Hate was better than apathy. Hate meant she still felt something. He didn't read the contract. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his Montblanc pen and flipped to the signature page. Wait, Wuxia said sharply. Read the stipulations. This is not a real marriage. Separate bedrooms, no physical contact, no interference in each other's private lives. If you violate any clause, you forfeit your remaining shares to Apex. Mingju looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a terrifying, predatory intensity. I don't care about the clauses, Wuxia. I don't care about the company. If tying myself to you is the only way to keep you in my sight, I will sign my soul over to the devil. He signed his name with aggressive sweeping strokes. The domestic Cold War. Moving into the Tsai marital mansion was a psychological torture Wuxia had meticulously planned, but severely underestimated. The mansion, located in the elite Dragon Ridge district, was a sprawling estate of glass, steel, and cold marble. On their first night, the tension in the house was so thick it was difficult to breathe. Wuxia had claimed the master suite in the East Wing. Mingju was relegated to the guest suite in the West Wing. At 200 am, Wuxia lay awake in the massive, unfamiliar bed. The silence of the mansion was deafening. She stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She had won. She had the man who destroyed her completely under her heel. So why did she feel like she was suffocating? Through the walls in the dead of night she heard a sound, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. They moved down the hallway, stopping exactly outside her thick oak door, and Wuxia held her breath. She didn't move a muscle. On the other side of the door, Mingju stood in the darkness, clad only in a pair of suit trousers, his bare chest rising and falling. He raised his hand, his knuckles hovering mere millimeters from the wood. He wanted to knock. He wanted to shatter the door, drag her into his arms, and beg her to tell him what had broken her so completely. But he remembered the coldness in her eyes, the hatred in her voice. He lowered his hand, resting his forehead against the heavy wood instead. For hours, he stood there, separated from the only woman he had ever loved by 2 inches of oak and an ocean of unspoken grief. Inside the room, Wuxia listened to the sound of his ragged breathing seeping under the door crack, a single treacherous tear slipping down her cheek and soaking into her pillow. Chapter 4: Shadows in the House. The corporate charity banquet at the St. Regis was the social event of the season, marking the first public appearance of the newly power couple. The ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and the city's elite buzzing like vultures smelling fresh blood. And Wuxia stood at the center of the room, a vision in a backless emerald green silk gown that clung to her curves like liquid glass. Mingju stood beside her, looking devastatingly handsome in a midnight blue tuxedo. To the cameras, they were the picture of passionate matrimony. Mingju's hand rested firmly on the bare skin of her lower back. His touch burned her, a branding iron of heat that sent violent shivers up her spine, but she maintained her flawless, plastic smile. "You're trembling," Mingju murmured, his lips brushing against her ear for the benefit of the paparazzi. His breath was warm, smelling faintly of expensive scotch. I'm disgusted, and Wuxia whispered back, her smile never wavering. "Take your hand off me before I break your fingers." Mingju's jaw clenched, his grip tightening imperceptibly before he slowly, agonizingly let his hand drop. Before the tension could dissipate, the crowd parted, and a woman walked through. Song Ru-wei. She was as delicate and beautiful as an Wuxia remembered, dressed in a fragile white lace dress that made her look like an innocent angel. But an Wuxia knew the rot that lived beneath that angelic facade. Ru-wei smiled, a saccharine, venomous curve of her lips, and glided directly toward them. "Mingju," Ru-wei cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She deliberately ignored an Wuxia. "I just returned from Paris. I was so heartbroken to hear about the company's troubles. And your sudden marriage." She cast a pitying glance at an Wuxia. "I suppose desperate times call for desperate alliances." Mingju's face turned into a mask of absolute frost. "My marriage is none of your concern, Ru-wei." "Excuse us," but Ru-wei was relentless. She stepped closer, placing a delicate hand on Mingju's lapel. "You don't have to pretend with me. We all know she bought you." Before Mingju could forcefully remove her hand, another voice cut through the air, smooth and dangerously charismatic. "I believe the lady is occupied, Miss Song, and frankly, you're ruining the aesthetic of our circle." Guyan, the project director of Apex Holdings, stepped into the fray, tall with lazy, laughing eyes and an aura of effortless danger. Guyan had been an Wuxia's closest confidant during her 4 years in exile. He wrapped a possessive arm around an Wuxia's shoulders, pulling her slightly away from Mingju. "An Wuxia, darling," Guyan smiled, "the investors are asking for you. Shall we?" Mingju's vision went red. The sight of Guyan's hand on an Wuxia's bare shoulder triggered a primal, violent jealousy that bypassed all his legendary self-control. He had spent the last month sleeping in a cold bed, walking on eggshells, trying to atone for sins he didn't even fully understand, while this man touched her with casual intimacy. "Take your hand off my wife," Mingju snarled, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating register. The surrounding guests fell dead silent. Guyan raised an eyebrow, entirely unfazed. "Your wife on paper, we both know who she really trusts." And Wuxia felt the explosive tension. "Enough," she hissed, stepping out of Guyan's embrace. She glared at Mingju. "Don't make a scene. I'm going to the balcony for some air." She turned and fled the stifling ballroom, pushing through the heavy glass doors onto the deserted terrace. The night air was cool, but it did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She gripped the stone balustrade, closing her eyes, trying to block out Ru-wei's voice, Mingju's anger, the ghosts of the past. Behind her, the glass doors opened and slammed shut. Heavy, aggressive footsteps approached. Before she could turn, a large hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around and slamming her back against the cold stone pillar. Mingju towered over her. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and dilated with a mixture of alcohol and feral jealousy. The scent of whiskey and his dark, masculine cologne enveloped her completely, suffocating her senses. "Does he touch you?" Mingju demanded, his voice a raw, broken rasp. He pinned her wrists to the pillar with one hand, his chest heaving against hers. "Does he touch you like I used to? Does he know the sound you make when you fall apart? You're drunk." "Mingju, let me go." And Wuxia struggled fiercely, kicking at his shins, but he was immovable, a mountain of muscle and despair. "I'm out of my mind," and Wuxia, he roared, the sound echoing into the night. "I am dying inside. Every day I look at you and you look through me like I'm a ghost. I signed your damn contract. I gave you my company. I am bleeding out at your feet, and you smile at him, because he didn't destroy me." And Sia screamed back, tears of pure fury and old trauma springing to her eyes. He didn't throw me away. Mingju stared at her, his chest heaving, his eyes tracing the furious tears trembling on her lashes. The dam broke. With a low, desperate groan, he crashed his mouth down onto hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was an explosion of 4 years of starvation, grief, and unhinged obsession. His lips were brutal, punishing, and desperately hungry. He forced her lips apart, his tongue claiming her mouth with a violent intimacy that tasted of whiskey, salt, and despair. Angst whimpered, her mind short-circuiting. The trauma response kicked in. The smell of his cologne, the aggressive heat of his body, it transported her straight back to the night of the accident. The rain. The blood, the absolute betrayal. She bit down hard on his lower lip. Mingju jerked back with a sharp hiss, blood welling on his lip. He looked down at her, the feral light in his eyes slowly fading into horrifying realization as he saw her face. Angst was completely pale, trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with a terror that cut him to the bone. She wasn't just angry. She was terrified of him. "Don't," she whispered, her voice cracking, sliding down the stone pillar. "Don't ever touch me again." Mingju backed away, wiping the blood from his mouth, his hands shaking. He had just become the monster she always believed he was. Chapter 5, Unraveling the Threads. The morning after the banquet, the mansion was a tum. Mingju had left before dawn, leaving Angst alone in the sprawling, silent house. She sat in the library, trying to focus on a quarterly earnings report, but her lips still burned with the phantom bruising of his kiss. Her mind was a chaotic vortex. The raw bleeding agony in his eyes last night didn't align with the cold, calculating man who had abandoned her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of an uninvited guest. The heavy oak doors swung open and Madame Tsai walked in. The matriarch of the Tsai family looked older, the sharp, aristocratic edges of her face worn down by the recent stress of the company's near collapse. She stood by the doorway, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane, surveying Angst with a complex, unreadable expression. "So," Madame Tsai said, her voice dry and brittle, "you've successfully returned to exact your revenge. You have my son collared and my company in your pocket. I hope you are satisfied, Miss Lin." Angst stood up slowly, her spine stiffening into her armor. "I am merely conducting business, Madame Tsai. Something you are intimately familiar with." Madame Tsai let out a bitter, raspy laugh. "Business? Yes, you think you know everything about what happened 4 years ago, don't you? You think my son is a monster who threw you away for power. I know exactly what he is," Angst said coldly. Madame Tsai's eyes flashed with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. "You know nothing. You think he married Song Ru away out of greed. The Xi Corporation wasn't just facing bankruptcy in Xia. We were facing criminal syndicates. My late husband had incurred debts with underground creditors. They threatened to burn this family to the ground. They threatened you. I went to you with that check to make you leave, to save your life. But you were too stubborn." Angst froze. The air in the room seemed to thin out. "What are you talking about? Mingju never touched Ru Wei." Madame Tsai spat out, tears of frustrated grief pooling in her aged eyes. "He used her family's wealth to pay off the syndicate, and then he discarded her. He destroyed his own soul to build a fortress around you, and when he finally secured the company and went back to find you, you were gone. He spent 4 years tearing the world apart looking for you. He didn't sleep, he barely ate, he was a walking corpse." Madame Tsai turned away, leaning heavily on her cane. "Hate me all you want, Angst, I was cruel. But do not hate him. He loved you more than he loved his own life." The matriarch left, leaving Angst standing in the center of the library, the world tilting precariously on its axis. "It's a lie," her mind screamed. "It's a manipulation, driven by a sudden, frantic need for the truth." And Angst marched to Mingju's private study, the room he explicitly forbade her from entering. She pushed the door open. The room was Spartan, except for a massive steel safe built into the wall. She knew Mingju. He was a creature of habit. His passwords were always significant dates. She typed in his birthday. Error. The company's founding date. Error. With trembling fingers, she typed in the date of their first kiss under the university awning. 0815 click. The heavy steel door swung open, and Angst sank to her knees, her breath catching in her throat. The safe was not filled with corporate secrets or offshore bank accounts. It was a shrine. Inside were hundreds of faded train tickets to every city in the country, stacks of private investigator reports, all bearing her name, all marked status, unfound. At the center of the safe lay a small velvet box. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside rested a simple, exquisite diamond ring, engraved on the inner band with the words, "To my only home forever." Beneath the box was a medical file. It detailed Mingju's battle with severe clinical depression and insomnia over the last 4 years. Angst dropped the files. Her hands flew to her mouth to muffle the gut-wrenching sob that tore from her chest. The narrative she had built her entire survival upon was crumbling into dust. He hadn't abandoned her. He had sacrificed himself to save her, and she had spent the last month torturing him for it. But what about the phone call? A tiny, terrified voice in her head whispered. What about Ru Wei answering his phone while I was bleeding in the street? The truth was a tangled, bloody knot, and Xia was terrified of what she would find at the center. Chapter 6: The Illusion of Betrayal. The storm brewing outside the mansion was violent, lightning violently illuminating the dark, sprawling corridors, but the storm inside was far more destructive. Song Ru Wei, sensing Ming Ju slipping entirely from her grasp and witnessing the thawing of an Xia's icy exterior, enacted her final, most venomous gambit. If she couldn't have Ming Ju, she would destroy the foundation of his sanity. At 8:00 p.m., an explosive scandal detonated across every major media outlet in the country. The headlines screamed in bold, damning letters: the fake marriage, Sai Xiao bought by rival ex-lover. The entire, confidential contract marriage document was leaked online. But that was not the killing blow. Sent directly to Ming Ju's private email, from an encrypted anonymous server, was a highly classified medical dossier. It contained photographs and hospital records from a private clinic in Switzerland, dated 3 years ago. The documents detailed Lin Xia giving birth to a child, the listed father, Gu Yan. Ming Ju sat at his desk, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off his pale, horrified face. The screen showed a manipulated photograph of an Xia smiling warmly beside Gu Yan, holding a bundle of blankets. The insecurity that had plagued Ming Ju for 4 years, the terror that he was unlovable, that he had fundamentally ruined her, and that another man had healed her crystallized into a blinding rage. The alcohol from the previous night, the exhaustion, the stress of the corporate leak, it all snapped the final tether of his rationality. He printed the documents, his movements terrifyingly calm, and walked out of the study. He found an Xia in the living room. She was pacing frantically, holding her phone, dealing with the fallout of the leaked contract. She saw him enter, his face a mask of absolute murder, and the phone slipped from her hand. Ming Ju threw the stack of papers violently onto the glass coffee table. They scattered like dead leaves. Is this why? Ming Ju's voice was unnervingly quiet, a whisper before a hurricane. Is this why you look at me with such absolute disgust? Why you flinch when I touch you? Because you belong to him. And Xia looked down at the papers. Her eyes widened as she read the fabricated medical reports. Birth certificate, mother, Lin Xia. Father Yan. For a moment pure, unadulterated shock paralyzed her. Then, a slow, burning inferno of indignation ignited in her chest. The man who had abandoned her, the man who let his other woman mock her, while she lay dying in the street, was now accusing her of betrayal based on forged garbage. Where did you get this? She demanded, her voice trembling with fury. Does it matter? Ming Ju suddenly roared, kicking the heavy glass table. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, sending shards flying across the Persian rug. Tell me it's a lie, Xia!
Look me in the eyes and tell me you didn't spend the last 4 years building a family with that bastard while I was tearing my soul apart looking for you.
And Xia looked at him. She saw the madness in his eyes, the absolute lack of trust. He believed it. He actually believed she was capable of this. The vulnerability she had felt in the study that morning vanished, replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of pride and trauma. You want to know the truth about my body, Ming Ju? Xia stepped forward, her voice dropping into a deadly venomous whisper. She stepped over the broken glass, ignoring the crunch beneath her bare feet. You want to know what happened to me 4 years ago? She grabbed his hand and violently yanked it down, pressing his palm flat against her lower abdomen. Ming Ju flinched, trying to pull away, but she held him there with hysterical strength. There is no child with Gu Yan. An Xia hissed, tears finally spilling over her lashes, hot and furious. But there was a child, right here. 4 years ago, when you told me you were marrying Ru Wei, I was carrying your baby. Ming Ju froze. The world stopped spinning, the air evacuated from his lungs.
The warmth of her stomach beneath his hands suddenly felt like a bed of burning coals.
No, he whispered, his pupils dilating in absolute horror. No, and Xia, you never told me. I tried. And Xia screamed.
The sound tearing from her throat, raw and agonizing, the sound of an animal caught in a trap. I ran into the street to find you.
I was hit by a car, Ming Ju. I lay in the freezing rain, bleeding out onto the asphalt, losing our baby. And as I was dying, I called you. She shoved him backward. Ming Ju stumbled, his legs suddenly incapable of holding his weight.
He fell to his knees amidst the shattered glass, completely oblivious to the shards slicing into his tailored trousers and skin.
I called you, and Xia sobbed, her imposing corporate armor entirely shattered, leaving behind the broken, bleeding girl from 4 years ago. And Song Ru Wei answered your phone. She told me you were in the shower, and to have some dignity and stop calling. While your child died inside me, you were with her. No! Ming Ju screamed, a sound of such pure, gut-wrenching agony that it vibrated the windows. He grabbed his hair, his mind fracturing. No, and Xia, I swear to God, I swear on my life, I never slept with her. I didn't have my phone! I left it in the office when I went to meet the syndicate. I never got the call. I didn't know. Oh God.
I didn't know. He crawled toward her over the broken glass, leaving a trail of blood on the rug, reaching out to grasp the hem of her dress. He looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, his aristocratic pride utterly annihilated.
He looked like a man who had just been condemned to hell. Anaxia, please tell me it's not true. Tell me I didn't kill our baby. He begged, his voice broken into 1,000 jagged pieces. Anaxia looked down at the man kneeling in his own blood at her feet. She felt no triumph. She felt no vindication. She only felt bone-deep terminal exhaustion. The contract is void. Mingju, she whispered, turning away from him. I'm leaving. Don't look for me again. I don't have the strength to hate you anymore, and I certainly don't have the courage to love you. She walked out of the house into the pouring rain, leaving Tsai Mingju screaming her name into the empty, shattered room. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. The private investigator's office smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap coffee. Mingju sat rigidly in the metal folding chair, his clothes still stained with dried blood from the shattered glass, his face haggard and unshaven. He had not slept, he had not eaten.
He had spent the last 48 hours deploying every resource at his disposal to uncover the absolute,
unvarnished truth of the night. Anaxia was hit. The investigator, an ex-detective with tired eyes, slid a thick manila folder across the desk. You were right to have me dig into Song Rua Wei's financials from 4 years ago. Mr. Xai, the investigator said grimly, the hit and run wasn't an accident. The driver of the black sedan received a wire transfer of 2 million yuan from a shell corporation tied directly to the Song family trust 3 days after the crash. The police report was doctored. The 60V footage from that intersection was wiped by a hacker employed by Rua Wei's brother. Mingju stared at the folder. The words buzzed in his ears like a swarm of hornets. Rua Wei hadn't just intercepted the phone call. She had ordered the hit. She had intentionally murdered his unborn child and nearly killed the only woman he loved. And for 4 years, he had allowed that woman to walk in and out of his social circles, speaking to him, breathing the same air as him. A darkness absolute and terrifying descended over Xi Mingju's soul. The man who sat in that chair was no longer a CEO. He was an executioner. He stood up, his movements slow and terrifyingly precise. Send these files to the chief of police, and leak the financial trail to the dark web. I want the Song family eradicated before sunset. He left the office and stepped into his waiting Maybach. To an Xai's apartment, he ordered his driver. Now, the rain scene. The sky opened up, unleashing a torrential, violent downpour as Mingju's car pulled up to the modest apartment building where Anaxia had been staying since leaving the mansion. Mingju didn't wait for the umbrella. He threw open the door and sprinted through the freezing rain, his expensive suit instantly soaked, clinging to his large frame. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. I will spend the rest of my life on my knees, he promised himself frantically. I will bleed for her every day. I will rebuild her world piece by piece. Just let me see her. Just let me hold her. He reached her floor and practically threw himself at door 4B. He pounded his fists against the cheap metal. Anaxia, open the door, please, he roared over the sound of the thunder. I know everything. I know what she did. Please, let me in. Let me beg for your forgiveness. Silence. He pounded harder, his knuckles splitting open, warm blood mixing with the cold rainwater dripping down his hands. Anaxia, an elderly neighbor opened a door down the hall, peering out nervously. Young man, stop shouting. You'll wake the whole block. Mingju spun around, his eyes wild and desperate. The woman in 4B. Where is she? The old woman flinched. Miss Lin, she left 2 hours ago, with a suitcase. Said she was going to the airport. Moving abroad for some MOBA program, she told me. The world dropped out from beneath Mingju's feet. He stumbled back, hitting the wall. The breath left his lungs in a painful rag gasp. Too late. He ran back out into the storm, leaping into the car, screaming at his driver to get to the international airport. He broke every traffic law, his mind a singular, frantic loop of terror. When he burst through the sliding glass doors of Terminal 3, completely drenched, bleeding, and looking like a madman, the departure boards glared down at him mockingly. Flight of 459 to Geneva departed. Mingju walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac. He watched a silver plane disappear into the thick, stormy clouds. His knees buckled, slowly, in the middle of the crowded terminal. Surrounded by staring strangers, the untouchable, invincible CEO of Psy Corporation collapsed to the floor. He curled his hands into fists, pressing his forehead against the cold tiles, and wept. He wept for the child he never knew, for the woman he failed to protect, and for the soul he had irrevocably shattered. Thousands of miles above him, Anaxia sat quietly by the window of the airplane. She watched the dark storm clouds give way to a brilliant, blinding sunrise over the horizon. She rested her hand gently on her flat stomach, closed her eyes, and finally, for the first time in 4 years, breathed in peace. Chapter 8.
the fall of the House of Sai. 1 year later, the destruction of the Song family was a spectacle of biblical proportions.
The business world watched in terrified awe as Kai Ming-Jui dismantled a century-old dynasty piece by bloody piece. It wasn't just a corporate takeover, it was a systematic annihilation. Ming-Ju exposed Ruo Wei's embezzlement, leaked the evidence of her bribing police officials, and orchestrated a hostile buyout of every single supplier the Song family relied upon. Within 6 months, the Song patriarch suffered a stroke, the family declared bankruptcy, and Song Ruo Wei was arrested at the border trying to flee the country, screaming Ming-Ju's name as the handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists. But vengeance did not bring peace. Without an Wuxia, Ming-Ju was a ghost haunting his own life. He worked 20-hour days, fueled by black coffee and self-hatred. The once vibrant CEO was now a gaunt, terrifying figure. He spoke in monosyllables. He fired executives for minor infractions. He was a machine built for war, completely devoid of humanity. In the VIP ward of the city hospital, Madame Tsai lay in a sterile white bed, connected to a labyrinth of monitors. The stress of the past year had broken her health entirely. Ming-Ju stood by the window, staring blankly at the city skyline, dressed in his customary black suit. Ming-Ju, his mother's voice was a fragile wisp of sound. He turned, his expression blank. Yes, mother. You have destroyed your enemies, she coughed, her frail hand clutching the white sheets. You have secured the empire. But look at you. You are dead inside. The empire means nothing if there is no one to inherit it, no one to share it with. Ming-Ju looked at her, his dark eyes hollow. I built this empire to protect her. Without her, it is just concrete and paper. I don't care about it anymore. He walked to the bedside, placing a thick manila envelope on her nightstand. What is this? Madame Tsai asked, her eyes widening. My resignation, Ming-Ju said quietly. I have transferred my controlling shares to the board, with a trust set up for your medical care. I am stepping down as CEO of Tsai Corporation, effective immediately. Madame Tsai gasped, struggling to sit up. You can't do this. This is your legacy. Where will you go? I am going to find my wife, Ming-Ju said softly, and for the first time in a year, a tiny flicker of life returned to his dead eyes. And if she won't have me, I will spend the rest of my life watching her from afar to make sure she is safe. That is my only legacy now. Geneva, Switzerland. The air in Geneva was crisp, smelling of pine needles and snow. The cobblestone streets of the old town were quiet, a stark contrast to the relentless noise of the metropolis Ming-Ju had left behind. He had tracked her down months ago, but he hadn't dared to approach. He knew he was toxic to her, but today he couldn't stay away. Wuxia walked out of the university library, wrapping a thick woolen scarf around her neck. She looked healthier. Her cheeks had a natural flush. Her hair was longer, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and the icy, corporate armor was gone, replaced by a quiet, understated elegance. She walked toward the bus stop, her breath pluming in the cold air. As she looked up, she froze. Standing across the narrow street, beneath a wrought iron street lamp, was Ming-Ju. He wasn't wearing his bespoke Tom Ford suits. He wore a simple black overcoat, his hair slightly unkempt, his face thinner, the shadows under his eyes betraying profound exhaustion. He didn't move toward her. He just stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking at her as if she were a mirage that would vanish if he blinked. The heavy, silent tension stretched between them, louder than any screaming match they had ever had. There was no anger left, no corporate machinations, just two deeply broken people standing in the snow. And Wuxia stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. Then, the bus arrived, pulling up between them and blocking her view. When the bus pulled away, Ming-Ju was still standing there, waiting for her verdict. And Wuxia turned and walked away down the snowy street. Ming-Ju closed his eyes, accepting his sentence, and slowly began to follow her from a distance, a shadow swearing to protect the light he could no longer touch. Chapter 9, The Wife-Chasing Crematorium. He didn't return to the empire. He stripped away his ego, his wealth, and his pride. Ming-Ju rented a small, cramped apartment 2 streets away from an Wuxia's flat. The man who used to command billions now spent his mornings at the local bakery, clumsily learning French to buy her favorite almond croissants. He never approached her directly. He knew her boundaries. But he made his presence known through micro-actions of absolute devotion. When Wuxia stayed late at the library, studying for her finals, she would find a thermos of hot chamomile tea and a fresh croissant left on her desk when she returned from the restroom. When a heavy snowstorm hit the city, she woke up to find her walkway completely shoveled, while Ming-Ju nursed blistered hands in his freezing apartment down the street. One evening, 3 months into his silent vigil, Wuxia was walking home from a late study group. The streets were dark and a drunk, aggressive man stumbled out of a pub, blocking her path and shouting lewd comments in slurred French. Wuxia stepped back, her heart racing, gripping her pepper spray in her pocket. But before the man could take another step toward her, a tall figure materialized from the shadows of an alleyway. Mingju didn't say a word.
He grabbed the drunk man by the collar of his coat and slammed him against the brick wall with terrifying, controlled violence. His dark eyes promised absolute murder. He whispered something in the man's ear, a tone so dark and venomous the man instantly sobered, nodded frantically, and ran off into the night. Mingju stood there, his back to Wuxia, his shoulders rising and falling heavily. Slowly, he turned around. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough, thick with suppressed emotion. It was the first time they had spoken in over a year. And Sia looked at him. She saw the burn marks on his hands from trying to learn how to cook. She saw the snow in his hair from standing outside her building for hours just to make sure she got home safely.
The invincible Sia was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, devoted guardian. "Why are you doing this, Mingju?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly in the cold air. "You're a king back home. You have everything. Why are you freezing in a foreign city playing bodyguard to a woman who told you she doesn't want you?" Mingju took a slow step forward, stopping exactly 3 feet away from her, respecting her space. He looked down at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Because I am nothing without you," he confessed, stripping his soul bare on the cobblestone street. "I don't care about the company. I don't care about the money. I only care about the fact that you smile when you drink chamomile tea, and that you hate walking in the snow, and that I owe you a lifetime of atonement. You don't have to forgive me, Wuxia. You don't ever have to love me again. But please, just let me stay in your periphery. Let me take care of you. It's the only reason I am still breathing." Wuxia looked into his eyes, searching for the manipulation, the arrogance, the lie. She found nothing but raw, bleeding, absolute sincerity. The ice fortress she had built around her heart over the last 5 years finally, imperceptibly, began to crack. She looked down at her boots, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "I don't have the courage to love you anymore, Mingju. The thought of hoping again, it terrifies me."
"What if you let go again?" Mingju slowly reached out, his trembling fingers gently grasping the edge of her woolen scarf.
He didn't touch her skin, he just held the fabric as if it were a holy relic. "I will never let go," he swore, his voice a low, fervent vow into the winter night. "I will spend every second of the rest of my life proving to you that my hands are safe. Take 10 years Wuxia, take 50. I will stand right here until you are ready." A single tear slipped down Wuxia's cheek. She didn't pull the scarf away. For the first time, she let him stay. The atonement, to prove his love, was no longer selfish.
Mingju took the final step to clear her name globally. He flew back to the city for exactly 48 hours. He held a massive, globally televised press conference, standing before hundreds of flashing cameras.
He did not speak as a CEO. He spoke as a repentant man. He publicly confessed his negligence.
He exposed the forged medical documents that had ruined Wuxia's reputation. He detailed Ruowei's crimes,
officially announcing the closure of the hit-and-run case. Wuxia is a woman of absolute integrity and unparalleled brilliance, Mingju declared to the world, looking directly into the main camera, knowing she would be watching in Geneva. "Every mistake, every misunderstanding, every tragedy of our past was born of my arrogance and my failure to protect her. She owes me nothing. I owe her my life. I am issuing this statement to ensure that no shadow of my past sins ever touches her again."
When Wuxia watched the broadcast on her laptop in her small apartment, she finally broke down. She cried not out of grief, but out of the profound, overwhelming release of a burden she had carried alone for 5 years. He had finally seen her.
He had finally vindicated her. Chapter 10, Redemption and Eternity. The spring sun in Geneva melted the last of the snow, turning the city into a vibrant painting of blooming flowers and green lakes. Wuxia's heart, too, had slowly thawed. Over the past year, Mingju had kept his promise. He rebuilt her trust from absolute zero. He never pushed for physical intimacy. He simply existed as her steadfast companion. He helped her study, he cooked her disastrously burnt but lovingly made meals, and he listened to her talk about her fears without ever offering unsolicited advice. He became her best friend, her protector, and slowly, the man she fell in love with all over again. When Wuxia finally received her MEoW diploma, walking across the stage to the applause of her peers, she looked out into the crowd. Mingju was standing at the back,
holding a modest bouquet of white jasmines, the flower she had loved in university.
He looked at her with such overwhelming pride and devotion that it took her breath away. After the ceremony, by the serene edge of Lake Geneva, Wuxia walked up to him. She took the jasmines from his hands, burying her face in the sweet fragrance. "Thank you," she said softly. Mingju smiled a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You earned it. I'm incredibly proud of you." Wuxia looked up at him. She reached out, her small hand gently tracing the sharp line of his jaw. Mingju froze, his breath catching in his throat at her voluntary touch. He closed his eyes, leaning into her palm like a starving man offered bread. "I'm ready to go home, Mingju," she whispered. Mingjui opened his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. To the city. To you, she corrected softly, rising on her tiptoes to press a gentle, feather-light kiss to his lips. I'm ready to come home to you. The return. Their return to the city was quiet. There were no press conferences, no grand corporate announcements. They moved into a beautiful, sunlit villa by the sea, far away from the cold marble mansion of their past. Madame Sai, now confined to a wheelchair, visited them. The haughty, cruel matriarch was gone, replaced by a frail old woman who wept openly when she saw an Wuxia. She pressed a centuries-old jade heirloom bracelet into an Wuxia's hand, bowing her head in a tearful, profound apology. Generational trauma, forged in cruelty, was finally put to rest with forgiveness. One evening, as the sun set over the ocean, casting a warm, golden hue across the wooden deck of their villa, Mingju got down on one knee. He didn't offer her a contract. He didn't offer her a company. He held up the simple diamond ring he had kept in his safe for 5 years. An Wuxia, he said, his voice thick with emotion, looking up at her with eyes that held the entirety of his soul. 4 years ago, I thought saving your life meant letting you go. It was the greatest mistake of my existence. I have walked through hell to find my way back to you. I promised to be your shield, your equal, and your home. If I hadn't let go that day, I would have married you then. Will you let me marry you now? An Wuxia looked at the man kneeling before her, the man who had torn down empires and his own pride just to see her smile. The ghosts of their youth were finally laid to rest, replaced by a love forged in the fires of absolute destruction and rebirth. Yes, she whispered, tears of pure joy spilling over her lashes. Yes, Mingju. They married simply, standing barefoot on the sand, with only the ocean as their witness. Epilogue. 2 years later, the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore was a rhythmic, soothing lullaby. Inside the sunlit nursery of the seaside villa, the walls were painted a soft, warm yellow. An Wuxia sat in a comfortable rocking chair, reading a book. She looked radiant, glowing with a profound, unshakable peace. Her hand rested gently on her heavily swollen belly. She was 8 months pregnant. The door opened quietly, and Mingju stepped in. He had returned to the corporate world, but entirely on his own terms. He was no longer the ruthless tyrant, but a measured, brilliant leader who left the office precisely at 500 p.m. every day. He took off his suit jacket, rolling up his sleeves, and knelt beside the rocking chair. He pressed a tender, lingering kiss to an Wuxia's lips, then rested his cheek against her warm stomach. How is my little one doing today? He murmured, his voice rumbling softly against her skin. Right on cue, a tiny sharp kick met his cheek. Mingju gasped, pulling back slightly, his eyes wide with a wondrous, childlike "oh" that made an Wuxia laugh, a bright, musical sound that healed every broken piece of his soul. He leaned back in, wrapping his strong arms around her waist, resting his head in her lap. He closed his eyes, listening to the rapid, strong heartbeat of their unborn child echoing through the silence of the room. It was the sound of redemption. It was the sound of life. I love you, an Wuxia, Mingju whispered into the warm, golden afternoon, his final, eternal promise. I will never ever let you go.